When two Supreme Court justices tried to silence one woman, no one expected the storm that followed. The chamber was thick with tension, every eye trained on the long table where Representative Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her notes spread neatly before her. She had barely begun her sentence when the interruption came not from one, but from both ends of the bench. Justice Sonia Sotomayor leaned forward sharply, her voice cutting through the air, while Justice Brett Kavanaugh followed, overlapping her words with his own. The clash of authority was as jarring as the crack of a gavel, and for a moment, it felt as though the weight of the entire court had descended on a single voice. The gallery gasped. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, each flash capturing the collision of power and defiance. Reporters hunched over their notepads, pens flying to keep pace with history unfolding. The silence that followed the justice's intrusion was not empty, it was charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Every person in that room knew they were witnessing something raw, something dangerous, something that could alter the balance of perception far beyond those marble walls. Sotomayor's words carried the force of the robe, laced with impatience, demanding restraint. Kavanaugh's tone was sharper still, pressing like a hammer against Crockett's sentence. Together, their authority seemed absolute, as though the gavel had fallen and her voice was already dismissed. But Jasmine did not flinch. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes steady, and her silence brief though it was felt louder than their interruption. The gallery seemed to hold its breath. In that pause, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Two towering figures cloaked in centuries of institutional power, and one congresswoman whose very presence represented millions who had been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to know their place. It was no longer just an interruption. It was a test of whether dignity could withstand the full weight of authority. Crockett inhaled slowly, letting the quiet stretch until even the justices leaned back, waiting. And then she leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady, her resolve unshaken. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to bow, and what she said next shocked the entire nation. The weight of the room was unmistakable. This wasn't a committee hearing tucked away in some Capitol corridor, nor a minor courtroom dispute destined to fade into obscurity. This was the marble fortress of American justice, the chamber where the final word on freedom and rights is supposed to echo with fairness. Yet in that moment, it felt less like the sanctuary of democracy and more like an arena, one woman on one side, two towering figures of authority on the other. Jasmine Crockett sat at the narrow table, her shoulders squared but her frame dwarfed by the magnitude of her opponents. To her left, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, robed in black, her voice sharp with command. To her right, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, leaning forward with the casual confidence of a man who had never been told to stay quiet. The imbalance was not just visual, it was systemic. Two justices, embodiments of entrenched power, pitted against one congresswoman whose only weapon was her voice. The contrast was staggering. Crockett did not arrive cloaked in the majesty of lifetime appointment. She did not sit above others on a raised dais. She walked in with nothing more than the authority granted to her by the people who had elected her: immigrants, working families, women who had been silenced for too long. Her presence itself was a statement. That power is not only inherited through institutions, but earned through struggle and service. The stakes stretched far beyond her own defense. Every interruption carried the suggestion that a woman like her could be cut off, dismissed, diminished, and every moment she held her ground, threatened to flip that suggestion on its head, reminding the country that democracy's heartbeat is not the robe or the gavel, but the voices of those who refuse to be silenced. Reporters sensed it. Their scribble slowed, as if even their pens needed to pause to absorb the magnitude of what was unfolding. The gallery sensed it too, no longer just spectators, but witnesses to a symbolic clash between the people and the pillars that so often overshadow them. And somewhere beyond those walls, America was listening, ready to decide whether this was merely a sharp exchange or a turning point in how power is defined. For Crockett, the stakes were never about personal pride. She wasn't defending her ego. She was defending the idea that every person who sends representatives to Washington deserves to be heard without intimidation. The justices might have thought they were silencing one congresswoman, but the truth was heavier, sharper, more dangerous. They were trying to silence the millions she stood for, and that was a battle she could not afford to lose. The silence after their interruption still lingered, an invisible pressure in the room. Every eye stayed locked on her, waiting to see whether she would fold under the weight of centuries-old authority or rise to match it. What hung in the balance wasn't just one moment, one exchange, or even one woman's dignity. It was the test of whether the American experiment still honored the principle that power belongs not to the few who sit above, but to the many who refuse to sit down. The confrontation would test not just her voice, but the values America claims to stand for. To understand the shock of that moment, one has to appreciate the gravity of who sat across from Jasmine Crockett. These were not ordinary lawmakers or pundits eager for their turn at the microphone. These were Supreme Court justices, figures who occupy a near-mythical place in the American imagination. Their words, once written, are etched into precedent. Their decisions ripple through generations. In the public eye, they are untouchable, cloaked not only in black robes but in centuries of reverence for the institution they represent. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, often hailed as a beacon of progress, embodied the paradox of authority that afternoon. She carried the story of a Puerto Rican daughter of the Bronx who rose to the highest court, inspiring countless Americans who saw themselves in her journey. She was, for many, a symbol of what was possible when perseverance met opportunity. But symbols can be complicated, and power, even in the hands of those who have endured struggle, has its own sharp edges. In that chamber, Sotomayor's tone was not the language of inspiration. It was the clipped voice of control, the reminder that hierarchy is enforced, even by those who once stood outside of it. To the gallery, her interruption may have carried the weight of procedure, but to Crockett it was something more pointed, the institution flexing its muscle, warning her not to stray beyond the boundaries that had been silently drawn. On the other side was Justice Brett Kavanaugh, whose very presence carried controversy like a shadow. His confirmation had ignited protests across the nation, his name forever tied to hearings that exposed deep fissures in America's soul. To his critics, he embodied privilege, unexamined, and arrogance, unchecked, the kind of man who could stumble into power without ever doubting that it belonged to him. His voice, when it cut into Crockett's, carried the familiar cadence of entitlement, as if her words were a nuisance daring to disrupt his comfort. Where Sotomayor wielded the quiet authority of discipline, Kavanaugh struck with the brash assurance of someone certain the system would always shield him. Together, they were a portrait of institutional dominance, one progressive by reputation, the other conservative by label, but united in their command of the space. Their questions were not mere inquiries. Their interruptions were not random. They were reminders that the robe is not just cloth, it is armor. The gavel is not just wood, it is a weapon. And those who wear and wield them often stand above consequence, their authority rarely challenged and even more rarely shaken. Against this backdrop, Jasmine Crockett's presence seemed almost impossible. She had no robe, no gavel, no gallery of clerks, or centuries of precedent to prop her up. She had only her voice, sharpened by years of advocacy, and her refusal to bow. Yet that contrast was the very heartbeat of the moment. Because if power exists only to protect itself, then the true test of justice is not how it shields the mighty, but how it listens to the marginalized. The brilliance of the justices' reputations was what made their attempt to silence her so jarring. Here was Sotomayor, who had once broken barriers, now using that very authority to enforce silence. Here was Kavanaugh, whose arrogance had already divided a nation, amplifying that arrogance in real time by dismissing a congresswoman mid-sentence. The gallery recognized it instinctively. The interruption was not procedural. It was personal. It was power flexing to remind everyone who truly ruled the room. In that flash of recognition, the justices seemed less like guardians of justice and more like gatekeepers, determined to remind Crockett, and by extension, every American who saw themselves in her, that the system was not built for voices like hers. Their power appeared untouchable, elevated by the trappings of the highest bench in the land. The robes lent them an aura of inevitability. The gavel lent them the final word. To stand against them was to stand against the full weight of history itself. And yet, the imbalance that seemed insurmountable was exactly what made the confrontation unforgettable. The image of two justices leaning forward to silence one woman told a story louder than any words. That power, when threatened, reveals its desperation. That even the untouchable robe and gavel could look vulnerable when dignity refused to bend. But the higher they sit, the harder the fall when dignity exposes arrogance. Jasmine Crockett did not step into that chamber by accident. Her journey to this moment was anything but smooth. A story carved not from privilege, but from persistence. From standing in rooms where she was never meant to be and refusing to leave quietly. She grew up far from the marble columns and ornate ceilings of Washington. Her childhood was ordinary in the way extraordinary lives often begin, rooted in modest neighborhoods, surrounded by families who carried more grit than glamour. From an early age, she was taught that justice was not an abstract principle debated in lofty halls, but something lived out daily, in whether her neighbors could afford medicine, whether her classmates were treated with dignity, whether her community was allowed to dream without barriers. These lessons did not come from textbooks. They came from watching the struggles of those around her, struggles that etched themselves into her memory like unshakable truths. Her first steps into public life were not as a politician, but as an advocate. She spent years in community service, walking into spaces where people felt ignored or discarded. She defended those without power, those without voices, those without the luxury of being heard. Courtrooms and town halls became her proving grounds, not because she sought the spotlight, but because silence was never an option when injustice reared its head. Each case she took, each community meeting she attended, sharpened her ability to cut through noise and lay bare the truth. By the time she entered the political arena, she was no stranger to resistance. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked, yet each dismissal only hardened her resolve. When she ran for Congress, many doubted she could win. She wasn't part of the political elite, nor was she groomed by the establishment. But she carried with her something more potent than institutional backing. She carried the trust of people who had long felt unseen. Her victory was not just a personal triumph. It was a signal that voices long relegated to the margins could rise to the center. In Washington, she quickly built a reputation as a firebrand. Her speeches cut with precision. Her questions in hearings left witnesses squirming, and her refusal to water down her convictions made her both a target and a beacon. Critics called her confrontational, supporters called her fearless. Yet beneath the fire was a striking composure. When others raised their voices, she knew when to lower hers. When others leaned on bluster, she leaned on facts. It was this paradox, fierce yet calm, passionate yet measured, that made her so difficult to silence. That day, when Sotomayor and Kavanaugh attempted to cut her off, she represented more than herself. She carried the weight of communities who rarely saw themselves in those chambers. Her voice was not simply her own, it was the echo of millions. Immigrants who crossed borders with hope, women who had been told their place was anywhere but the podium, working families who were told to be patient while the powerful dined on privilege. Every syllable she uttered, every pause she allowed to linger, was tethered to those millions who knew the sting of dismissal. And perhaps that was what unnerved her opponents most. She was not just Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman at a table. She was the embodiment of those who had been silenced for generations, suddenly speaking in a room where silence had too often been the rule. Her defiance was not loud or reckless, it was quiet, steady, undeniable. And in that steadiness, there was power. The audience watching her felt it viscerally. For some, it was the first time they had seen someone who looked like them, spoke like them, and lived like them refuse to shrink in the face of overwhelming authority. For others, it was a reminder that democracy is not maintained by the lofty few, but reclaimed by the relentless many. And for nearly everyone in that room, there was a dawning realization. She was not standing alone. She was standing as the voice of an America that had been ignored but was no longer willing to stay in the shadows. Admiration built not because she demanded it, but because she inspired it. The way she sat, unbowed, made people sit a little taller in their own chairs. The way she stared down authority made them wonder how many times they had accepted silence when they should have spoken. In her, they saw courage made flesh, courage that did not roar but whispered, and in that whisper carried the weight of thunder. Her firebrand reputation was intact, yes, but this was something more. This was the quiet strength of a woman who knew that true power is not in volume but in resolve. And as she prepared to respond, as the gallery leaned forward desperate for her reply, it became clear that the confrontation had transformed into something larger than a debate. It was no longer just Crockett against Sotomayor and Kavanaugh. It was dignity against arrogance, truth against intimidation, the people against the untouchable. And that voice, forged in struggle, was about to echo louder than two justices combined. The silence after her introduction lasted only a breath before Justice Sotomayor struck again. Her voice, clipped and impatient, sliced through the chamber. "Representative Crockett, you're out of order," she declared, leaning forward as if to physically push Crockett's words back down her throat. The sharpness of her tone reverberated across the marble walls, and for the first time, the gallery stirred an audible wave of murmurs, rippling like wind through dry leaves. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She held Sotomayor's stare, eyes unblinking, posture unbroken. But before she could respond, Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned in, his voice booming, laced with the ease of someone certain the system belonged to him. "Congresswoman, your credibility is in question here," he said, stressing each syllable as if to hammer down her presence. His words weren't just a challenge. They were an attempt to reduce her very identity to doubt, to frame her not as a participant in democracy, but as an intruder trespassing on sacred ground. The combination was suffocating. Two of the nation's most powerful judicial figures aligned against a single voice. One cloaked in the veneer of progressivism, the other dripping with entitlement. Their interruptions were not accidental. They were coordinated echoes of the same message, "Know your place." The room's energy shifted. Journalists lowered their pens mid-scribble, their instincts telling them this was more than a procedural clash. Gallery members shifted in their seats, restless, the unease of witnessing history collide with hierarchy. A few gasps broke free. Others whispered under their breath, trying to predict whether Crockett would fold or fight. Even the faint hum of the camera seemed louder, each click freezing the confrontation into permanence. Crockett's silence was deliberate. She could have rushed to defend herself, could have snapped back with fire, but she chose restraint. She inhaled slowly, a pause that stretched like the tightening of a drumhead. Her calm was unnerving precisely because it contrasted so violently with the justice's aggression. Every breath she took added to the suspense, her composure painting their interruptions as desperation rather than authority. Her stillness carried weight. It was the stillness of a storm-gathering force, the kind that warns sailors long before the waves begin to crash. The gallery recognized it instinctively. Raised eyebrows darted across the rows, eyes widened, people leaning forward as if anticipating a spark that would ignite the entire chamber. Kavanaugh pressed again, his voice louder now, betraying an impatience that hinted at unease. "Answer the question, Congresswoman. Are you even qualified to speak on this matter?" His words dripped with condescension, framing her presence as an anomaly rather than a right. Yet, the more he spoke, the more he revealed his discomfort. It was the classic mistake of arrogance, mistaking noise for strength, forgetting that silence can carry more authority than 1,000 raised voices. Crockett's pause became the fulcrum of the room. Reporters leaned forward, their pens hovering, ready to capture the moment history tilted. The justices, though cloaked in the authority of their robes, looked oddly unsettled by her refusal to meet their force with force. And the public in the gallery, every restless shuffle, every glance exchanged, felt the balance shifting. Still, she did not rush. She allowed the weight of their words to hang in the air, unchallenged for just long enough to expose them for what they were. Intimidation masquerading as procedure. By waiting, by breathing, she stripped their interruptions of their veneer of inevitability. In that silence, it became clear who was in control. The tension had built to its peak. The room no longer belonged to the justices or to the spectators. It belonged to the anticipation of her reply. Every second deepened the suspense. Every heartbeat in that chamber aligned with hers. And then, with every eye locked on her, Crockett leaned into the mic. The microphone seemed to hum beneath her fingertips as she leaned forward. For a moment, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. The chamber held its breath. Two justices loomed before her, their robes like armor, their authority as heavy as centuries of precedent. Yet her silence was heavier still, the kind that shifts the ground before an earthquake. When voice finally came, it was calm, calmer than anyone expected, calmer than the justices deserved. "With respect," she began, her tone even. "Authority does not equal truth." The words fell like stones into a still pond. Reporters froze mid-sentence. The gallery hushed. Even the cameras seemed to slow their clicks, waiting for the next line. She let the pause linger, her eyes sweeping the chamber before landing squarely on Justice Sotomayor. "You wear the robe," she said softly. "But a robe does not give you the right to silence justice." The subtle defiance in her phrasing jolted the room. Sotomayor's brow tightened, a flicker of irritation flashing across her face. But Crockett didn't waver. She shifted her gaze to Kavanaugh, her voice steady but rising in intensity. "And you, Justice Kavanaugh, you question my credibility? I stand here because millions of voices sent me here. Their credibility flows through me. Who sent you here? A lifetime appointment does not mean a lifetime of being right." A low gasp swept across the gallery, the kind that no gavel could quiet. Crockett paused again, measuring each beat like a conductor holding back the orchestra until the exact moment. Her repetition carved the point deeper. A robe does not silence justice. A gavel does not silence the people. An interruption does not silence the truth. Kavanaugh's jaw tightened. He leaned back in his chair, his bravado thinning as if her words had reached a place beyond procedure, beyond debate. Sotomayor, usually quick to parry, held her tongue. Her lips pressed together, eyes narrowing, but no words came. For the first time in the exchange, it was the justices who seemed unsettled, caught in the dissonance of authority clashing with unflinching dignity. The gallery stirred. A smattering of whispers rose, followed by the faintest clap, quickly stifled. But momentum is a current, and Crockett could feel it turning in her favor. She pressed forward. "I was elected to speak for the families who work 2 jobs and still can't afford rent. For the immigrant who built this country's roads but is told she doesn't belong. For the women who are told to lower their voices while decisions are made about their bodies. That's who I carry with me into this room." She leaned closer, her voice sharper now. "So when you try to silence me, you're not silencing Jasmine Crockett. You're trying to silence them, and I will not let that stand." The words rippled through the chamber, landing like thunder. Reporters scribbled furiously now, pens scratching across paper. Photographers leaned into their cameras, desperate to capture the expressions, the stunned stillness of Sotomayor, the tightening discomfort of Kavanaugh, the fire in Crockett's eyes. The Congresswoman let her voice soften again, a deliberate ebb after the crescendo. "This chamber is supposed to embody justice. But justice doesn't cower before authority. Justice doesn't bow to robes or gavels. Justice speaks, even when told to be quiet. Especially then." She repeated the line, slower this time, every syllable deliberate. "Especially then." The chamber was electric. Murmurs turned to gasps. Someone in the back whispered, "She's right." And the phrase seemed to travel like static, catching fire across the room. Crockett's rhythm quickened, her words building like a drumbeat. "You can cut off my words, but you cannot cut off the truth. You can dismiss my questions, but you cannot dismiss the people I represent. You can raise your voices, but you cannot drown out the millions who rise with me." By now, applause had begun in pockets, hesitant at first, then swelling as more hands joined in. The marshals shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene or let the wave crest. But Crockett did not pause to acknowledge it. She stayed locked on her adversaries, her voice cutting through the rising noise. "Kavanaugh, you asked if I was qualified. Let me tell you this. My qualification is the people who gave me their trust. My qualification is the fight I carry from every community ignored by this system. My qualification is the truth, and no robe, no gavel, no title will ever outweigh that." The gallery erupted in cheers before falling silent again, almost in awe of the spectacle unfolding. The applause was not just for her words, it was for the audacity of a single representative standing eye to eye with the untouchable. Crockett's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper now, forcing the room to lean in. "I know what you want. You want me to falter, to doubt, to second-guess whether my voice belongs here. But I belong here because the people belong here. And unlike your robe, unlike your gavel, their power cannot be taken away by interruption." Kavanaugh shifted in his chair, his once confident smirk replaced by a strained rigidity. Sotomayor's eyes flickered downward, as though searching for ground that had suddenly disappeared beneath her. Neither interrupted again. Neither dared. And then, with perfect timing, Crockett delivered the line that would echo beyond the chamber, beyond the headlines, beyond the moment itself. She straightened, placed her hand firmly on the microphone, and declared, "You can silence my microphone, but you cannot silence the truth." The chamber exploded. Applause roared, gasps echoed, and whispers flew like sparks. Some in the gallery stood unable to contain the surge of emotion. Reporters shouted over one another, their voices clashing with the thunder of clapping hands. The sound was uncontrollable, a storm of validation and release. And with that, the chamber erupted, and the ripple effects began. The chamber had barely settled before the outside world caught fire. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's defiant mic drop was everywhere, cut, captioned, and shared in dizzying speed. By the time she had stepped out of the marble fortress and into the humid Washington air, the digital storm had already begun. On Twitter, the first hashtag appeared like a spark: Crockett silences judges. Within an hour, it was trending nationwide. By nightfall, it was global. Close behind came another: truth over power. The hashtags climbed the charts as if the entire internet had decided, in unison, that this moment belonged to history. Commentators on cable news scrambled to keep up. CNN played the clip on loop, anchors wide-eyed as they marveled at how a lone congresswoman had stared down two Supreme Court justices. MSNBC broke from scheduled coverage, calling the exchange a defining clash of our era. Even Fox, usually dismissive of voices like Crockett's, could not resist replaying the moment, though their framing dripped with disdain. Still, the footage spoke louder than any spin. And in living rooms across the country, people who had long felt invisible leaned forward, rewinding, replaying, nodding through tears. They saw themselves in Crockett's steady voice, in the defiance that did not need shouting to thunder. The posts came pouring in. A school teacher in Detroit tweeted, "For once, someone stood where we can't and refused to be shut down." This was history. Jasmine spoke for all of us. An immigrant mother from Texas shared on Facebook, "I watched my daughter's face as Crockett spoke. She whispered, 'That's me. For that, I will forever be grateful.'" Celebrities added fuel to the blaze. Viola Davis posted the clip with the caption, "This is how you wield truth with dignity." Lin-Manuel Miranda simply tweeted, "Mic dropped. Truth over power." Even LeBron James weighed in. Respect, courage, leadership. Jasmine Crockett just showed the world how it's done. Activists turned the moment into rallying cries. March organizers in New York plastered Crockett's image across posters, her defiant gaze underlined with her closing line, "You cannot silence the truth." College students from Berkeley to Boston clipped the soundbite for TikTok edits, layering her words over protest footage, making her voice the anthem of a generation tired of being muted. And it wasn't just the famous or the organized. Ordinary Americans made their voices part of the chorus. A truck driver filmed himself from a highway rest stop saying, "I don't care what side you're on. That woman spoke from her gut, and it hit me right here," tapping his chest. A nurse in Chicago posted, "On my night shift, I replayed it 3 times. I finally felt heard." A teenager stitched the video with tears in her eyes, whispering, "I've never seen anyone like me stand so tall." The ripple spread offline too. Sunday sermons quoted Crockett's words as modern scripture. Coffee shops buzzed with debates, strangers bonding over the moment. High school debate teams dissected the exchange, marveling at the precision of her composure under pressure. In barbershops, in nail salons, in subway stations, people were talking about the congresswoman who would not be silenced. Even politicians took note. Allies praised her bravery. Opponents dismissed it as grandstanding, but their critiques only fed the momentum, their disbelief amplifying the impact. A senator was overheard muttering to a colleague, "She just rewrote the playbook." Through it all, the clip remained untouchable. No amount of spin, no condescending op-ed, no snide remark from detractors could erase the raw power of the moment. Crockett's calm stare, her voice steady and clear, carried a gravity that transcended politics. It became not just an exchange in a chamber, but a symbol of who gets to speak in America and who refuses to be silenced. The internet had made its verdict. This was not just a viral clip. It was a cultural touchstone. People weren't simply sharing it, they were claiming it, embedding it into their own stories. And yet, beyond the retweets, the likes, the headlines, and the montages on primetime television, something deeper was happening. Something slower, quieter, but infinitely more profound. In neighborhoods across the nation, hearts stirred with a dangerous, uncontainable thought. If she can stand there, so can I. Because beyond the screens and headlines, the real impact struck deeper in the heart of the nation. As the noise of the chamber faded into memory and the headlines began to blur into repetition, Jasmine Crockett understood the deeper meaning of what had just unfolded. This was never truly about her against two justices. It was never about titles or resumes, robes or gavels. No, the clash was about something much larger, something every American, whether in a courtroom or a corner store, could feel in their bones. It was about dignity against arrogance. She had not entered that chamber to prove herself superior. She had entered it to remind the nation that dignity does not need permission to exist, and truth does not require validation from authority. When the powerful leaned on their robes, their titles, their lofty positions, Crockett leaned on something they could not touch, the collective heartbeat of the people. Her voice reframed the entire confrontation. What some had expected to be a moment of humiliation became a mirror held up to the system itself. She showed the country that arrogance, even when dressed in the regalia of power, cannot withstand dignity when it refuses to bow. The robes, the gavels, the elevated seats, all the symbols that were meant to silence her suddenly looked smaller, stripped of their untouchable glow. The lesson stretched far beyond the chamber walls. How many times had working people been told to stay quiet? How many times had women been cut off mid-sentence? How many times had immigrants, people of color, the marginalized, been told their voices carried no weight against the machinery of power? Crockett's calm defiance answered them all. She reminded America that its promise was never about untouchable elites perched above the rest. The promise was that every voice mattered, that equality was not symbolic, but lived, that justice was not ornamental, but real. The founders wrote it into the bones of the Republic, even if they failed to live it themselves. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. And Crockett had brought that dusty phrase roaring back to life. Her crescendo carried with it the universality of struggle. This moment, she declared later, was not about Congresswoman Crockett versus Justices Sotomayor and Kavanaugh. It was about the eternal test of whether truth can be drowned out by power. And America answered, it cannot. Those words rippled like a benediction. They landed not just in the ears of the faithful, but in the hearts of the weary people who had stopped believing that justice could be more than a slogan. Her defiance gave them permission to believe again. And as the nation digested what it had seen, the moral became inescapable. Robes and gavels mean nothing if they are used to silence truth. Titles mean nothing if they are used to deny dignity. Authority, when wielded arrogantly, crumbles the moment it faces a voice anchored in justice. The confrontation, at its heart, was never about legal procedure or parliamentary squabbles. It was about America's soul. Could one person, armed only with dignity, stand before two of the most powerful figures in the land and prevail? Crockett had answered yes, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever wondered whether their voice mattered. And so, the story did not end with applause or trending hashtags. Its true ending was quieter, but stronger. It lived in the hearts of millions who, watching from afar, felt a surge of recognition. She's us in that room. That dignity is ours too. Because in the end, it wasn't power that triumphed, it was dignity. Two judges tried to silence Jasmine Crockett. Two voices, heavy with power, cloaked in robes, backed by centuries of authority, leaned in to cut her short. But in the end, it wasn't she who fell silent. It was them. Their interruptions, their weighty authority, their confidence, all of it crumbled in the face of a single voice that refused to bow. The very attempt to silence her became the moment that silenced them. That's the paradox of arrogance. It mistakes power for permanence. But dignity, when wielded with clarity and calm, will always outshine arrogance. What the world witnessed was more than an exchange. It was a reminder of what America is supposed to stand for. Not robes, not gavels, not titles, but truth. Because Crockett showed us that truth is louder than interruption, that the people's voice is greater than any single institution, and that when one person stands with dignity, they stand for millions. And now, the question turns to you. Will you let this moment pass as just another clip, or will you make it part of something larger? If you believe truth must always be louder than titles, share this video. Let others see that power is not untouchable, that arrogance is not unbeatable. Subscribe and join us in amplifying voices rewriting history. Because the story of dignity rising above arrogance is not just Jasmine Crockett's story, it's our story, and it's only just beginning.